Alrighty, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about sabermetrics, more specifically sabermetrics in baseball. So I guess the title we're going to be taking a look at what are sabermetrics and how have sabermetrics impacted the game of baseball. Um, I'm really passionate about this topic, and by the end of it, I hope that you guys can see how passionate I am, and you guys can pick up on a thing or two. It's kind of my whole goal here, so let's just jump right into it. So, what are sabermetrics? I'll tell you what, when I first learned about sabermetrics, I really struggled trying to grasp what exactly sabermetrics even were. So, we can just go over some textbook definitions here and take it for what it is, but I would prefer to explain this in a little bit of a different way to you guys. So, when I looked it up on Google, because I wanted to give you guys a little context about what it's on the internet, it's sabermetrics aim to quantify baseball players' performance based on objective statistical measures. So what does that mean? To the unfamiliar audience, that doesn't mean a whole lot at all. It could be like statistics and how these players are doing, and how they're doing in baseball. Like for all I know, like it could be any of those. But when you take a deeper look at it, it's pretty much deep diving into certain statistical areas in baseball to sort of see things that you wouldn't normally be able to see. So it's just digging under the surface level. There's a guy on the right here. His name is Bill James. Bill James is a philosopher in baseball, and he's a pioneer, no doubt. He in 1980, right around there, came out with this book, and he was essentially talking about sabermetrics in baseball. And when this book got around to all the owners, they didn't know what to think. They were so confused and they were like kind of star-stunned by these new ideas that Bill James was presenting to them. He was telling us about how we can make objective knowledge about baseball through statistics. And instead of trying to like buy wins, essentially, essentially, it's instead of trying to buy players, you need to think of it in terms of buying wins. In order to do that, you can do that through multiple statistical tests, and sort of just eliminating that eye test that sort of like former scouts would always take into account here. So Bill James, his definition of sabermetrics is the search for objective knowledge about baseball. That is a lot easier to understand than the first one, in my opinion, to an unfamiliar person, to an unfamiliar audience about baseball. It's just like, okay, so what can I know about statistics to sort of quantify wins in baseball? Sabermetrics, like I say here, it just allows us to see what we couldn't see before. And I think that if we go over an example of this, it'll kind of show for itself what I'm talking about here. All right. Here are two phenomenal baseball players, but I add. Yoenis Cespedes, a former Detroit Tiger, New York Met. And we have Alex Rodriguez, who is a perennial player, future Hall of Fame. He's got all the bells and whistles about baseball. He's got all the accolades, anything you could ask for a player. So let's take a look at these guys. So Yoenis Cespedes in 2015 had a batting average of 287, home runs 35, and an OBP of 328. Those are really really good stats in baseball. Anytime you're hitting anywhere near 280, phenomenal. Then you got Alex Rodriguez, who's the Hall of Famer, the All-Star, just the player that everyone wants on their team. He batted 250, which is probably a down year for Alex Rodriguez, honestly. He had 33 home runs, which is very respectable, and an OBP of 356, which is definitely above the league average. So I would prompt you guys, like, which player would you want? On your roster, there's no salary cap. If we're just taking a look at these players, who would you want, And on paper here, you would probably just look at Yoenis Cespedes and see that 287 batting average compared to A-Rod's 250, and you'd be like, maybe I want Cespedes over Alex Rodriguez, but it also depends on your team needs. But, like, the answer isn't glaringly obvious right here at this point. So let's take a look at this next slide. Same players in the same year, Yoenis Cespedes, Alex Rodriguez, and you can see that all their stats are pretty much the same, besides one, and it's glaring. In order to have Yoenis Cespedes on your team, you're paying $3.7 million a year. 3.7. That is nothing in the retrospect. Instead, you're paying A-Rod, Alex Rodriguez, $22 million, which is going to definitely take a chunk out of your salary cap. And to any owner, it just doesn't jump off the page. Like, you're seeing, like, okay, take a look at this value that we could get in Yoenis Cespedes compared to Alex Rodriguez, And Sabermetrics is how we see that, So, although the stats that we always used to look at, all the scouts, everything besides just before Sabermetrics, we would look at this and be like, we want Alex Rodriguez. But now that you look at this and see the value that you could get out of Yoenis Cespedes versus Alex Rodriguez, you probably go with Yoenis Cespedes because you're going to get just as much out of him, plus you have an extra $18 million in cap to spend. All right, the next topic I want to talk about in regard to Sabermetrics is the new school versus old school. And boy, oh boy, is this glaring, and this topic that I'm going to get into a little bit later. But let's just go over some of the quick differences between the new school and the old school. All right, the first one that jumps off the page is in the new school is that they're a lot more statistical, data-based, and sabermetrics minded. What I mean by that is they don't just look at a player and assume they're all that. You know what I mean? A guy who has that beautiful swing and you see the immaculate pop off the bat, that doesn't mean a whole lot to him because that guy, he might be a monster off the batting tee. When he goes up in a game, he can totally just bat 180 and just never make the league. Just although he has that beautiful swing, it just doesn't justify his data that backs it up. The old school, on the other hand, takes a look at the coveted eye test, as I like to call it. And you see this in all sorts of movies from back in the day. You see all these scouts who are old and stuck in their ways, and they're like, oh my goodness, this player is immaculate. I saw him hit one ball, and it went 110 miles off the bat. It was just the most beautiful swing ever. But what does that mean? You know what I mean? You don't necessarily know what a player has until you can back it up with stats. And that's what sabermetrics do. The old school eye test was valid in some situations. These scouts have years of experience, and they can usually judge based on a swing, but it's so much less reliable. So that's one of the main differences between the old school and the new school. The new school believes that the game is always evolving. The old school is kind of, like I said earlier, stuck in their ways. They want to maintain the authenticity of the game. And one of probably the biggest differences between the new school and the old school is with regards to the tools. This is a concept that probably you guys don't have a lot of experience with, so I'll jump into it real quick. When scouts are trying to look at players, scout, analyze these players, they look at different categories. So they call them tools. So a 5-tool player is a perennial talent, can't miss. If you have 5 tools, that is extremely rare. Usually a prospect that is going to get drafted usually has 2 or 3 of these tools, and they're going to try to develop them. Another one of those tools when they come into the big leagues. So that's kind of the old school way of looking at it. Those 5 tools include hitting for power, hitting for contact, your fielding ability, your arm strength, and your speed. So those are the 5 tools that scouts always look for. But that's more or less not that important when you're taking a look at the new school age of baseball. They kind of replace those 5 tools with data. They look at different like launch angles. You look at different. Instead of looking at that beautiful swing, they can now quantify that beautiful swing and kind of see their ability through numbers. That's what sabermetrics really are. So that is kind of like a few of the main differences in the new school and old school. And this will be very glaring when I get into an example about the Oakland A's in 2002. Here's a perfect example of the new school and old school in the point where I talk about the game is always evolving and the maintaining the authenticity of the game. To a new school minded fan or analyst, anything of the game, they'll see this and they'll be like, wow, what are they trying to do here? You try to look and analyze, like, why do they have 5 infielders? Where did the right fielder go? And this is what they call the shift. The shift is where they actually use sabermetrics to analyze this player's tendencies at the place, which at this case appears to be Nick Markakis, who's an outfielder for the Atlanta Braves. And they kind of analyze where his tendencies are when he hits the ball, like what percentage of the time does it go this way, that way, and they can align their defense accordingly. The old school has this very, very serious problem with this. They believe that it just takes away from the love of the game. They're kind of stuck in their ways. They're like, now, where did the traditional defense go? We don't have a shortstop. There's a giant gap out there in right field. There's no even right fielder. This upsets them. And, I mean, rightfully so to them, I guess. But I understand where they're coming from. But this just goes to the game is evolving. And the new school way of looking at and through Sabermetrics is definitely changing the game. And that's a point that I want to highlight. All right, let's get into it. The Oakland A's in 2002, probably the most historic team in all of baseball in terms of small market, big market, in that difference. The year before this, in 2001, the Oakland A's had a very solid roster. They had a lot of players in their system who were all on expiring contracts. Those players are Johnny Damon, Jason Giambi, Jason Isringhausen. All All-Stars, top 50 players in the league, without a doubt. But they're a small market team. Their salary cap can't compete with those big markets over there in Boston and New York. So they really had to devise a way in which, how are we going to come back in 2002 to replace these all-stars when we don't have the money to do anything with our roster? So the manager, Billy Beane, who was a former player, had to get a little. He had to think outside the box here on this one. And quite frankly, it wasn't even his idea how to build this roster. It was the guy right under him that I say is Mr. Peter Brand, a Yale graduate with an economics degree. And Peter Brand saw the vision. He saw the vision of Sabermetrics because he studied under Bill James for a little while and read his book and thought it was Bible. Essentially, everything he said was the end-all, be-all, and it made so much sense to him. But everyone was kind of scared to try it out because at this point, if you fail in your business as a manager, that's like your job on the line. So no one wanted to be the pioneer to do this. But Billy Beane had to think outside the box, went out there, hired Peter Brand away from Cleveland, and then they came together and became a duo in which they embraced Sabermetrics to the fullest. The point I want to get into here is between the new school and old school is the board meetings that these guys would have. And it's insane to read about because you have two guys who want to operate on the new school with Billy Beane and Peter Brand. And then you have 10, 11, 12 scouts in there who are old school guys. And they're just stuck in their ways. They're talking about how, a player's appearance and how that gives them confidence. And player's got to have confidence. If he has an ugly girlfriend, then he has no confidence. That's literally the logic that these guys would use. And it's just kind of interesting to see the dynamic between Beane and Peter Brand and the other scouts who are trying to operate and build this roster in different ways. So eventually, Billy Beane, who is the general manager, had the end-all, be-all say. He decided to sign players according to using Sabermetrics. So I guess what they did here, to explain it to you guys, they had to replace these three players. And they had to think outside the box, like I said earlier, and they were like, okay, so there's no way we could replace Johnny Damon for $10 million a year, Jason Giambi for $20 million a year, and Isringhausen for another $15 million a year. There's just no way they could afford to do that. So they're like, okay, what are all these guys' on-base percentage? Add them all up, divide them by 3. We need 3 players who can hit that on-base percentage to kind of recreate them because they weren't going to be able to re-sign them. So in doing that, they used Sabermetrics to identify players that fit their system and that were indicators of winning, which I'm going to get into a little bit later. So they signed 3 players. They signed Jeremy Giambi. They signed David Justice, which is a cool story. They actually got David Justice through a trade with New York, and New York actually decided to pay half his salary to play against him. So I always love to read about that stuff because I think it's crazy. But they got David Justice, and then they signed a catcher from Boston who couldn't throw anymore. But his on-base percentage was .364. So they had 3 players who could hit .364 OBP and decided to replace that 3-headed monster that they lost the year before. And they all did this through Sabermetrics and identifying that on-base percentage was their indicator of winning. and that is how they were going to win. One thing I want to note, there were tons of doubt that's surrounding this organization. Everyone in the media was like, "What is Billy Beane even doing? He's literally gonna lose his job at this point." Even the manager doubted him. He didn't even want to go along with the scheme that Billy Beane put in place for him, and Billy Beane's his boss. So their dynamic is an interesting one also throughout in the Oakland A's. But eventually, this team started off bad, and it was really bad. They were like 6-20 to start off the year. Everyone was like, "What is Billy Beane doing? This experiment is not working. He's going to lose his job." Eventually, as the season goes on, they start winning and then winning more and then winning even more, in which they set an MLB record for most wins in a row, in which they won 20 games. 20 games in a row without losing, with this roster that they built for $43 million a year. Let that sink in. $43 million a year. The New York Yankees just signed Jason Giambi for $20 million a year. That's one player. But they got $25 million, or 25 players for $43 million. They ended up making it to the playoffs, in which they played the Yankees, but they ended up losing. But even though they lost, does not mean that was not a successful year, because quite frankly, it revolutionized the game. They spent $100 million less on their roster than the New York Yankees, but ended up winning the same amount of games, making it just as far in the playoffs, and they did it through Sabermetrics. All right, so what I want to get into now is small market versus big market teams. A famous quote by Billy Beane is that baseball is an unfair game. If you guys didn't know, baseball doesn't have a salary cap. You can look at the NBA, NHL, any other professional sports league besides soccer, I believe. There's a salary cap. You're limited in how much money you can spend on a player to build a team. That's not the case in baseball. If you have an owner that's willing to spend their money, consider the New York Yankees, I guess, they're going to do it. That's how they're going to win games. That's literally what they thought before Sabermetrics. It's like, okay, whoever has the most money is a big market team, is going to beat all the small market teams just because they have more money. And that's why it's an unfair game. However, Sabermetrics came in and filled the gap between these teams. They were able to identify these indicators that Sabermetrics gave them. And through these indicators, they were able to sign players that fit their scheme, and these schemes were able to fill that gap between the small market and big market teams. One thing that I also want to get into is that big market teams have begun to pick up Sabermetrics too, which has led to big-time success. And I want to talk about the 2004 Boston Red Sox in that case. In 2004, the Boston Red Sox won the World Series. They made a few moves. Actually, in 2002, after Billy Beane had all that success, they tried to steal Billy Beane from the Oakland A's to make him their general manager to implement his ideas of Sabermetrics. He was going to become the highest paid GM in all of baseball, but instead he decided to turn it down to stay with the Oakland A's. As a counter to that decision, the Boston Red Sox decided to sign Bill James, the guy who I highlighted earlier, who kind of created the philosophy of Sabermetrics. Not to be their GM, but he became an analyst in building their roster. That was his position. And he would identify players who could fit their scheme and fit the ideas that Bill James kind of created, and now they were going to implement that the Oakland A's did. I think one of their biggest signings that I want to highlight is David Ortiz, or better known as Big Papi. That boy, David Ortiz was a hitter. That's no doubt. He critically undervalued, might I add, though. To give it perspective, he had an OBP of 400. That means he got on base 4 times out of 10. That's Hall of Fame numbers. The average OBP out of a player in the MLB, I would say, is around 300. So that's 100 points higher than the average MLB player. But they're only paying him $1.25 million annually. They made a trade for him with the Minnesota Twins because the Minnesota Twins didn't truly understand the value that David Ortiz brought to the table. Because Bill James, his ideas with Sabermetrics is that in order to win game, or you shouldn't think about buying players, or you shouldn't think about buying players to build a roster. You should think about buying wins. In order to buy wins, you got to score runs. And they identified on base percentages the way that should be done. Because when you're on base, that's how you score runs. But this just goes to show that big markets can effectively use sabermetrics, not just small market teams. So when done effectively, a big market team that uses sabermetrics and then actually has the money to go out and buy the stats that they want, that are indicators of winning, goes to show that sabermetrics is the way to go. Right, so I just touched on statistical indicators earlier, but let's just go over them a little bit more in depth. So no longer are teams putting together rosters based on just scouting and the eye test, that beautiful swing that everyone sees, and that's how we always used to build rosters. We're now taking a look at stats that are indicators of winning, because when you win, that means you're successful and you're going to make the playoffs. Not you looking at a player and identifying how many tools they have, but when you have that hardcore data that can back it up, that's where you're going to have success. And these statistical indicators of winning are the way to go. One thing that I want to touch on is the copycat system. We saw this with the Oakland A's in 2002, and then we take a look at the Boston Red Sox 2 years later. What do? They copy their scheme. That's exactly what they did, but they just did it at a much more effective level. Because the Oakland A's were the first. They were the pioneers. But then after they saw it, they were like, oh my goodness. We just got to start buying players with stats that are indicators of winning. But the Boston Red Sox have the money to go out and buy big-time players that are indicators of this sort of winning. For example, David Ortiz, like I mentioned earlier. So here are an example of a few statistical indicators that we've seen over the years. On-base percentage, which I mentioned, and I'm not going to really go into anymore. WHIP, walks and hits per inning pitched. We're turning it on pitching now. It's not just hitting that sabermetrics are involved in. Pitching is an area where you could look at that and be like, that's how we're going to win games. In the mid-2000s, or 2010s, we saw a run on pitching. Pitching was the most important indicator of winning at the time. For example, the Detroit Tigers. We went out and we had Justin Verlander and Max Scherzer, who are all-stars and are running for the Cy Young. But then we go out and we trade for David Price, who is at the time the best starting pitcher in the league. All these guys' WHIP were super low, and that is where we found the value. And we ended up making it to the World Series and eventually lost. But WHIP was actually the indicator of winning at the time. And then most recently I want to get into is DRS, defensive runs saved. I think defense recently has been the topic of discussion around the league, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But defense is just as important. There's a guy named Kevin Pillar, Kevin Kiermaier. These two dudes are center fielders and defensive wizards. These guys can get to any ball, and they save just as many runs as any of them. And to have a guy like that in your team is an indicator of winning, because you're taking runs that they would score, and you're taking them off the board with these guys. So that's another indicator that we have seen in the most recent years. And then not an indicator, but I want to touch on this a little bit, is WAR, wins above replacement. Not that it's too relevant, but these teams, this is a new sabermetric tool that they all use. So now if we pick up a new player from a different team and sign them, and we replace them with our existing player, how many more wins is this player going to give us against this other player? That's what WAR is all about, and that's what recently people using sabermetrics have been using to identify if the player is worth it or not. In my opinion, this is what has changed the most with regards to sabermetrics, because you're no longer looking at baseball the same way after you know about sabermetrics. You're not buying players, you're trying to buy wins. Because now when you're putting together a roster, you're not buying players anymore. You're just trying to buy stats that are indicators of winning. So sabermetrics have drastically changed this. Right? The Oakland A's, on-base percentage. They didn't care if a dude could steal 40 bases. They didn't care if you had 140 RBIs. They just wanted dudes who could get on base. That's their indicator. And when you can put a roster together like that, you're going to be a lot more successful than when you're not because you have a vision. And then the value of players. This is a very interesting topic because every team doesn't do sabermetrics the same way. I haven't touched on that a whole lot, but just because one team has an indicator, a statistical indicator of winning, doesn't mean that another team has that same indicator as their indicator of winning. You know what I mean? And that's what drastically changes the value of these players. But we'll see actually a trend here in the next slide, and that is the market. The market value of these players is constantly changing, right? We see in 2002 with the Oakland A's, on base percentage. When they were in 2002, on base percentage was not priced high at all. So a player who had a good on base percentage was going for right about his market value. Anyway, you see the excess of the 2002 Oakland A's now, and now what do you see? You see the price of these players go up and up and up. So now the price to get a guy with a good on base percentage goes through the roof. Not necessarily through the roof, but you're paying more for that stat now. Because you're not buying that player, you're buying stats. That's the whole key to sabermetrics when building a roster. Different runs or runs of value depending on the trends of the league. So we can look at it for the trends I just said earlier. WHIP. The going price for when David Price was a free agent was through the roof. He had a WHIP of less than 1. So he's averaging less than 1 walk and hit per inning, which is nuts. And he gets signed to the Boston Red Sox after he leaves Detroit, and he gets paid $25-30 million a year, when the going rate for that more or less is $20 million. So it just goes to show that once the team identifies one of these indicators of winning, the market trend goes up and up and up for these players. This is what I want to get into. Value. How do you define value? What is a value? You know what I mean? What is a player worth? No one knows because everyone's thinking different things about a player. Everyone knows generally what a player is worth, but a team that might value a player more, or I should say values his statistic more, that he's proficient, is going to go for more money than another team and what they kind of think is his value is worth. So let's take a look at this example. A big-time slugger versus a role player with ideal stats for a team. On paper, the big-time slugger is obviously the better player. But if that role player is worth $1.5 million a year but has an OBP of 350, and your indicator is OBP, but this big-time slugger has an OBP of 350 as well, but then goes for $22 million a year, who are you going to go with? You know, that's the question that you have to ask is it really worth to get all those other stats that come along with the big-time slugger or the role player that fits your statistical indicator? You know, that's the price, or that's what you have to weigh. I'm not saying it's an easy answer, but it's definitely something you have to consider when talking about what is the value of these players. Because there's 30 teams in the league. Everyone's going to value a player differently. Everyone knows ballpark what it is, but at the end of the day, it all depends. But anyway, sabermetrics have redefined what value means. That's a common theme that you guys have seen throughout, I hope, is that sabermetrics have redefined baseball. Sorry about that. They have redefined baseball. Everything about it. Everything's changed because of sabermetrics, the way we look at it. And that's really the key, is perspective on the game. As a fan myself, I've learned so much more about the game because of sabermetrics. And I think a lot of other people have too, because they have forced the game to evolve. All right, here's probably the last key point I'm going to get into here today. So sabermetrics, hitting, pitching, and fielding. So nowadays, way more compared to way back then, we have technology. And this technology allows us to maximize player performance, which sabermetrics is so ideal for, to get the most out of a player, because now they can run so many diagnostics on players in all aspects of the game. So I'm going to get into a few pictures that I've come up with. And the crazy thing is that I have a pretty good perspective because I've actually used a lot of these tools and to kind of help me further my game, and I know that it works. So I'll talk about it a little bit here. The first I want to get into is the blast knob. And this is linked with this right here, which is a hit track. So essentially, this is what collects all your data. You attach it to the end of your bat, and now with your swing, it reads a bunch of data from like your launch angle to the trajectory of your bat, how fast the barrel is whipping through the zone, how fast the ball comes off the bat with exit velocity. You can now take a look at all that. They didn't have that in the past, but now they could actually know, like, okay, so now how quick do you have to be to the zone in order to get the maximum performance out of your swing? What launch angle do you need to get the most out of your swing? So it's all, it's revolutionized the game, honestly. That's just one aspect in hitting. All pros use this nowadays. This is how they have that most repeatable swing. It's because they know data about their swing at this point. It's not, how does it feel? Although it's important, they actually have data that can back up their swing now. Another piece of hitting technology, this is actually the one that I have not ever used, but I know people who have, is batter's hot and cold hitting zones. You can actually track where the pitch comes in nowadays, and depending on where that pitch comes in, you can identify whether or not you have tendencies that are going to allow you to hit for high average there. So as you can see here, Mike Trout, who's a future Hall of Famer, you can see his hot spots. You can see in these bottom 4 quadrants are the areas where he hits the best. So Mike Trout at the plate is searching for pitches in that zone, and he has data that could back it up that that's where he's hitting the ball the best. Now, a pitcher wants to pitch in the blue, right? The more that he can pitch in the blue, the better of a chance he has to get Mike Trout out at the plate. So that's a new way that Sabermetrics have evolved the game, and now that's the one we couldn't see before we had Sabermetrics, you know? That's why it's revolutionizing the game. Pitching, this is a good one. This is a pitch track, and this could tell you so many things about your pitching ability, and this is also synced up to the monitor. So this is the pitch track and then the monitor of what you're looking at. You're also connected to sensors as well that could give you more data on your pitching. This tells you how fast you can pitch, how much spin rate you have on your ball. So you want to have more spin on like your curveball because obviously you're spinning it to make it dive to the plate. So you can kind of keep track of all that. I really like this model right here where it's just his skeleton because then you could really see the movement of his pitch and you could really see his form come into place. This is how you get the most out of your pitching velocity and all that stuff. So you, along with your pitching coach, can take a look at this, analyze it, and be like, all right, where do we go from here? Like maybe you need to lock out that front leg a little more. And this is all backed up by data from the pitch track that can tell you exactly what's going on. And then if you make an adjustment and you see your stats go up, you know that you're doing something right. And that's what Sabermetrics are all about. The last one is fielding technology. This one is really cool in my opinion because it's StatCast, and this is really recent because you can actually see for outfielding mainly, but you can see like how fast he's got to the ball, the amount of distance he's covered, and route efficiency. The route efficiency is the one I kind of want to get into, which is like crazy to me about how they can actually judge in a matter of seconds how efficient he was to that ball. Like, could he have taken more strides or a different route to that ball to where it would have been more efficient? They can calculate that now, and that's all because of Sabermetrics, which is really cool. I wasn't planning on adding this when I made the video, but I have to get into the shift because recently that has been the most hot topic of all of baseball. Traditionally, defense is played third baseman here, shortstop, second base, first base, and then your 3 outfielders. But we actually have data now that can tell us where hitter tendencies are expected to hit the ball. So, right, let's take a look at Max Muncy, lefty, big-time pull hitter. Everyone knows that, but we would never in the past line up to the pull. So now we have our shortstop playing over the second base bag, and we're giving up all this area because only 16% of the time just backs once he hit the ball in this area over here. So why would we not put more fielders on the right side of the field in order to, if that's where he's going to hit it? It just makes sense intuitively. There's a lot of discrepancy regarding this topic, however, I might add, because the old school doesn't like this at all because it takes away from the glory of the game. But as a new school new school fan, if you couldn't tell already, I love Sabermetrics. I love it, but I know that there is some controversy going on with that, and it could potentially get revoked. But Sabermetrics show us where a player can actually hit the ball and his tendencies, and then as a result, we can effectively align the players accordingly to where he's expected to hit it. All right, conclusion. If you take anything away from today, Sabermetrics constantly evolved the game that we love. We've seen this with so many examples in the Oakland A's, the Boston Red Sox, the shift, constantly evolving. So who even knows what it could look like years from now? Sabermetrics have changed the way we build rosters, which I mentioned earlier. In terms of building a roster, you're no longer buying players, you're buying statistics. And more specifically, you're buying wins you're trying to buy wins. And then these players that have good statistical indicators of those wins are the players that you're going to try to buy. I said this just a second ago, but no one knows what Sabermetrics will look like in the future. But the one thing we do know is that it'll always be evolving, just like the game of baseball. So I hope you learned a little something today. I hope you could take away a little bit, learn a little bit. I hope you could see some of the trends in baseball and just everything the Sabermetrics are doing for the game. That's all I'm trying to do here, and I hope that you take that away with you guys. So I just want to thank you guys for sticking through the video, and I hope you guys enjoyed. Have a great rest of your day.